Hello everyone, welcome. We're delighted to have you all here tonight. We apologize for any inconvenience getting here. I understand traffic is bad and our parking lot is full, and we're really happy that you all made it. My name is Penny Wright. I'm the Director of Adult Programs here, and we're delighted to be offering, among other things here at the library, a little series of writers whose work we admire very much. After this program, we hope you'll take a peek at some of the things we have on, music and authors coming here, and take a copy of our newsletter, because I know some of you are outside of our library district. Tonight, however, we're most grateful and delighted to have a guest whom we actually met a year ago when her husband, Lawrence Goldstone, gave a wonderful talk here about his book called Birdman. We met Nancy Goldstone. We learned that she was
not as good as this.
Working on a book. We knew where there's a competent man, watch out, because look at who's sharing his writing life, and it happens to be Nancy Goldstone. And I know some of you know her, but others of you don't, so I'll tell you a few things about her. As you probably know from looking at her book, if you haven't already read it, she has a passion for medieval and Renaissance history and old and rare books. And she's here this evening to talk about her most recent book, titled The Rival Queens, Catherine de' Medici, her daughter Marguerite de Valois, and the betrayal that ignited a kingdom. It sounds exciting, and it really is. And I'm a little late in reading authors' works, and I'm into it now, and it really reads like a novel, and I hope you'll read it if you haven't already read it. But it's a nonfiction account of the life of the glamorous Queen Margot, made famous by the novelist Alexandre Dumas and her mother, the notorious Catherine de' Medici. Nancy's other works include The Maid and the Queen, The Secret History of Joan of Arc, which solves the 600-year-old mystery surrounding Joan of Arc, The Lady Queen, Queen of Naples, Jerusalem, and Sicily, an acclaimed biography of the only woman of the 14th century to rule a major European kingdom in her own right, and Four Queens, the Provençal sisters, who ruled Europe, the story of a family of four 13th century sisters, the daughters of the Count of Provence, who became the queens of France, England, Germany, and Sicily. Prior to Four Queens, Nancy Goldstone wrote 2 books of medieval history with her husband, Larry, in the back, acting in capacity of the light man tonight. So the books were The Friar and the Cipher, a narrative nonfiction account of the life of the great 13th century scientist Roger Bacon, and Out of the Flames, the story of 16th century theologian and physician Michael Servetus, who was burned at the stake by John Calvin, reputedly with the last copy of his book, in which he had hidden a great medieval discovery chained to his leg. She and Larry have also written 3 humorous memoirs on their experiences in the world of rare and antiquarian books. Titles are Used and Rare, Slightly Chipped, and Warmly Inscribed. Nancy Goldstone has written and reviewed for a number of publications, including the New York Times, the LA Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, and the Miami Herald. It is such a pleasure to have her here with us tonight. Please welcome Nancy Goldstone.
Thank you very much. Now you know everything about me. So. And thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it, especially in the brave the traffic. So I'm thrilled to be here to welcome you to the to the 16th century. There we go. Now we go. Okay. So, as you just heard, my new book is The Rival Queens. It's about Catherine de Medici, the Queen Mother of France, and her youngest daughter, Margaret de Valois, Queen of Navarre. I have been researching history and royalty for over a dozen years now, and what I like to do with my books is to present as absolutely accurate and historical portrait as I can, but in the most entertaining way possible, because I think that's really the challenge for an historian. After all, these people have been dead for a very long time, and there's absolutely no reason to care about them unless you can somehow breathe a little life into the situation. But for me, the reason that I write the books is that I am really, really curious about what actually happened. I'm not a person who likes any fiction getting in the way of my history. I want to get as close to truth as you can possibly get, as though they transported me back to the castle and I'm sitting there writing down every single thing they said. Now, to do that, I have to necessarily rely on the reports of the people who were actually living at the time. We call these primary sources. So that means that I spend my days going through pages and pages and pages of chronicles reports, letters, government reports, diplomatic accounts, financial accounts, war records, military strategy. It's military strategy. And necessarily, although the overall story that these sources tell is fascinating, some of this material can get a little dry. So what I do is I figure it's my job to read everything. And then when I sit down to write, I synthesize it, I cut away all the really boring stuff, and I present the material to you in a way that you can understand it and is hopefully compelling. But the research for this book was a little bit of an exception for me. Yes, I still had to go through the pages and pages and pages of the accounts and the diplomatic reports and the government reports and all of that stuff. The difficulty came when I sat down in the cutting of the material. Because unless I wanted to have a book that was 2,000 pages long, there was just no way I was going to get all the sex in. I have never seen anything like these people. I do not know how they got any sleep. This was a court that revolved around sex. Heterosexual sex, homosexual sex, lesbian sex, sex for advantage, sex for profit, sex for state secrets, treasonous sex, patriotic sex. You guys, you think I'm kidding? This is one of the most recognizable images from the period. It's not moving. There it goes. And these two are sisters. And at the very center of this teeming milieu of illicit passion and adultery and intrigue and nudity is one person. This woman right here. Boy, you wouldn't know what to look at her, would you? This is Catherine de Medici. In Italian, as my Italian friends would say, Caterina de Medici, but here in America, we make it a point to mangle other people's languages, so I'm going to use the American pronunciation. So, who was Catherine de Medici? Briefly, she was the wife of Henri II, King of France, and when he died in 1559, she took over as regent for her son, Charles IX, who was only 10 when his father died and too young to rule on his own. And she continued to rule all during Charles IX's reign, even after he grew up and came of age and could have ruled by himself. And she ruled all the way through to his premature death at the age of 24. And then she continued to be the major force in the government for her next son, who inherited the throne, Henri III, and stayed there almost until her death in 1589. So 1560 to almost 1589, over a quarter century of rule. Now, that's not quite as good a record as her contemporary on the throne of England. That's Elizabeth I. We all know Elizabeth I, who actually came to the throne at almost the same time as Catherine. Elizabeth came in 1558, and Catherine got there in 1560. But Elizabeth was younger when she ascended to the throne, and she lived all the way to 1603, an astonishing 45-year reign. I mean, you couldn't always expect to live that long, and especially in office. So, still, Catherine's, quarter century or so in power is still pretty impressive. I'm not going to lie to you, I had trouble writing about Catherine Medici. That's because I'm used to writing about women who I admire. It all started a while back with this book, Four Queens, about a family of four 13th century sisters, the daughters of the Count of Provence, who all became queens. Queen of France, Queen of England, Queen of Germany, Queen of Sicily. Very cool. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about one of them because I can't resist. The eldest sister, Marguerite of Provence, was married to Louis IX, King of France in the 13th century. So Louis IX, you should know, is one of the most revered kings in all of French history. They love Louis IX in France. He was even sainted. So during his reign, Louis decided to go down on crusade to Egypt. And he took a big army of Frenchmen down there and got to Egypt and had, I would say, one of the top 3 military disasters ever in French history. And it was terrible. It was terrible. Thousands and thousands of Frenchmen dead in the desert, and Louis himself captured and held for a crippling ransom. I mean, this made Waterloo look like a small setback. Less well known is that his wife Marguerite actually accompanied him on this expedition. And when he had his massive defeat in the desert, it was left up to her to salvage what remained of the operation. So this meant she had to hold a port city. You had to have a port because you had to have ships if you were ever going to get out, and you had to have ships to bring in supplies and things like that. She had to hold a port city. She had to negotiate his ransom. Then she had to send to France for his ransom, where his poor mother was regent in his place. She had to get the money together twice because the first time she sent it, it sank. And finally, the money gets to Egypt, to the port city that Marguerite's holding. She successfully makes the transfer. That in itself was very difficult to do. She gets him out, and he won't go back. He wants to try again. So she stayed with him over the course of the next few years, during which time she had 3 children. And she loved those kids, 3 children under the age of 5, all over the desert after this guy as a kind of visible reminder of his earthly responsibilities, until he finally gave in and agreed to go back to France to become the great king of French legend that you all know. And he's the saint. That's just one story in that book. Those women were fabulous. So after I finished that book, I said to myself, gee, and I had never heard of any of those women. Gee, I wonder if there are any other women who might have done something that I've never heard of. So I looked into the next century. I looked into the 14th century, and sure enough, I came up with this woman. This is Joanna I, 14th century queen of Naples, Jerusalem, and Sicily, and Countess of Provence. And this woman, Joanna I, was amazing. Just really briefly, I can't resist. So Joanna is married at the age of 7 to her 6-year-old Hungarian cousin, Prince Andrew. When she's 19, Andrew, who's kind of obnoxious, is murdered in an unknown conspiracy, in a mysterious conspiracy by unknown assailants. And the Hungarians, his family, take advantage of this to invade Naples because they accused Joanna of being the mastermind behind the crime. So Joanna is forced to flee her kingdom and go stand trial for her life in front of the Pope for the crime of murdering Andrew. There, she defends herself, wins a complete acquittal. You know how many women in history have been said to do that? I think 1. And then raises an army and goes back and gets her kingdom. And she rules for a further 30 years. She did a great job. She brought that kingdom back from the plague. She expanded their borders. She supported the arts. She supported women doctors. And she was a terrific diplomat. So here again, this is another just a great story. And in fact, I thought after Joanna that I had kind of hit the mother load. But I said, I'll look into the next century and just see. Maybe there's somebody there. And sure enough, I get the queen and the maid and the queen, who is Yolande of Aragon, 15th century queen of Sicily, Duchess of Anjou and Maine, and Countess of Provence. the Dauphin's mother-in-law, the Dauphin being the heir to the throne of France, and this is during the time of the 100 Years' War, where the English have invaded. And I have to say, of everyone I have written about, if I was really in a tight spot and could only choose one person to rely on, to come to my help, to come to my aid, or to give me advice, hands down, it would be Yola. She was the most competent, the most effective politician, male or female, and not just of her century, but I mean, I put her down against anyone in any century. She, not only did she bring Joan of Arc to the court and introduce her into the situation, but she was the one who was responsible for getting the expedition together to relieve the siege of Orleans. She got the whole military together. She paid for it all herself. She kept the kingdom together as much as she could while the English were invaded. And really, it was Yolan who, after Joan was killed, several years after that, lured the Duke of Burgundy away from his English allies, which really was the turning point in the 100 Years' War that allowed the French to get their kingdom back. And the great thing about her is that she did this all so deftly, and she hit her track so well that for the next 600 years, every historian and writer, including some of the great minds like George Bernard Shaw and Mark Twain, totally swallowed her cover story, because obviously it is far more likely that angels would come down to earth to direct the course of a battle than that a 50-year-old woman with decades of experience in political and military administration would actually be running the show. Okay? So I think you can see that what linked all these other books together for me was that I looked up to the women who I was writing about. Every one of these queens had a vision of rule that involved improving conditions, using a minimum of violence, and protecting her subjects, often at great personal risk. They were so brave, and I've come to understand that courage is a quality that is absolutely necessary to leadership. And it also happens to be one that I admire greatly, because I have to say, if all of us were transported back to the time when these women lived, and the arrows were flying outside the windows right now, I would be the first person under the desk. But now we come to Catherine. She's a little bit different kind of a queen than I'm used to writing about. Don't get me wrong, she's utterly fascinating, and she was so much fun to write about. This is my most fun book. But I couldn't really stand up here and tell you I admired her. What saved this book for me was her daughter, Marguerite de Valois, who went by her childhood nickname of Margot. This is my favorite portrait of her. Don't you just love all those curls in the hair? So you know Marguerite, if you know her at all, is the title character of the wildly popular, much beloved classic Alexander Dumas novel, La Reine Margot, Queen Margot. Or perhaps you had the good fortune to see Isabelle Adjani, beautiful Isabelle Adjani, portray her in the French movie that they made like 15 or 20 years ago. Now that was based on the movie. That was based on the novel. Certainly that's how I came to her story, because through the novel and the film. So Marguerite is famous in France because when she was 19 years old, her mother and her Catherine and her older brother Charles, let me get you a picture of Charles here. There's Charles. See, he's not 10 anymore. He's 22 when this happened. He's all grown up. Her mother and her brother Charles forced her to marry her 18-year-old cousin Henry, King of Navarre. Now, Marguerite was very publicly in love with somebody else at this time. She was in love with the dashing Duke of Guise. Let's get him up here. There he is. This is him. He's a little older now, but you can still see he's really got that bad boy look about him. And he was built like an Adonis. Believe me, he was mowing down at the court. So she's in love with this guy, but that's not why she objects to marrying Henry. The reason she doesn't want to marry Henry is that Marguerite is a devout Catholic, and Henry is the leader of the Protestant faction in France, which is known as the Huguenots. And to Marguerite, as to any devout Catholic at the time, Huguenots were heretics. And she was very concerned that if she married him, she would be forced to convert. And if that happened, then when she died, her soul would be consigned to the everlasting flames of hell, and this was a situation that she was seeking to avoid. And she had every reason to believe that she would be forced to convert because Henry's mother Henry was only 18. No 18-year-old ran anything. His mother was the head of the Huguenots and the head of Navarre. And she was a really strict Calvinist, and she was trying to convert everybody. So she was trying to make it a condition of the marriage that Marguerite convert. But luckily for Margot, her future mother-in-law dropped dead of an unknown ailment 2 months before the wedding while shopping in Paris. So that took care of that. Marguerite continued to protest, but teenage princesses actually don't have much say in these things. So in August of 1572, she was forced to marry her cousin Henry. Let me get a picture of Henry up here. Here's Henry. Let's just go back a second. This is the guy she's in love with. This is the guy she's married. So they have a big, in August of 1572, they have a big, splashy, royal, opulent wedding right outside the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. Now this marriage had been built by both Catherine and Charles IX, Margaret's older brother, the son, the king. They had been built all over Europe as a way to bring peace to the kingdom. Because the Huguenots and the Catholics in France had been fighting each other in a really bloody civil conflict for the past decade that was known as the Wars of Religion. And the problem was that France was then, and is actually still today, an overwhelmingly Catholic country. And at the time when Marguerite was marrying Henry, the Protestants, the Huguenots, by best estimates, only made up about 5% of the population. And they never got to, by best estimates, more than 15% of the population, even after a couple of decades of trying to convert people. So, but they were a very aggressive minority. Huguenots would go into Catholic churches, they would break the idolatrous stuff, they would destroy the idolatrous stuff, they would destroy the relics, just like ISIS does today when they go into a church in the Middle East. And in retaliation, the Catholics would go hunt down the Huguenots while they were singing their songs at services, or just get them in the streets. And eventually it got so bad they were raising armies against each other and fighting it out inside France. So this wedding that was supposed to be taking place between the very top echelon of French society, because you have Marguerite, who is a royal princess, a member of the royal family, there's no higher blood, and her cousin Henry, who is actually the first prince of the blood, which meant that he stood in line to inherit if all of Catherine's sons died without issue. This was being built as a way to bring peace and toleration, a Catholic and a Huguenot together at the top. This is going to usher in a new era of peace and toleration to the kingdom. And of course, this beautiful, beautiful ideal of what was going to happen just went right out the window 3 days after the marriage, when every single Huguenot guest was hunted down and killed in the streets of Paris in a terrible, notorious episode that is today known as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. So over the course of a week, somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 people, not just in Paris, but all in other cities also across France, died, most of them Huguenots, in this 1 week. Now there's a whole mystery about the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre because, hey, what happened here? Was this premeditated? Did this just happen? Who was behind it? Believe me, it's like an Agatha Christie mystery. There are so many people who could have done it. And of course, that's when all that curiosity wakes up in me, and I want to find out what really happened. So, because, hey, a wedding that goes that spectacularly bad, that's a mother-daughter relationship that's worth poking into, I think. So I went to look into it, and so a lot of the book is about who did it. It's kind of a whodunit, and uncovering the person who was responsible for these murders. But in the course of it, I also discovered a lot more about Marguerite. I'll get her back up here. Because I realized when I was researching that her reputation, based on the novel, based on what historians had been saying about her, was totally not who she was. Marguerite was actually highly intelligent, the best educated member of her family, and she had that level of courage that I look for. She was so brave. This woman had one narrow escape, one desperate adventure after another, after another, after another, and she was never a victim. She always met it head on. She was the one who had the vision of improving conditions with a minimum of violence and protecting your subjects at great personal expense. And I would tell you that one of her subjects that she protected the most was this guy, her husband, who will later, look at that face, that guy's going to turn out to be the Abraham Lincoln of French history. I mean, no, seriously, he becomes a great king. They were comparing him to like Lincoln. And he's dead many times over without her. She basically threw a net of protection over him. And what's so interesting about that is that she didn't want to marry him, and she didn't love him. That she just did it because she had she rose to her responsibilities when she married him and became queen. That this was what her job was to do. And also, she was offended she did not want one single other death to happen because of her, or she was a victim here, but she didn't want to have any responsibility for it. And she gets a really bad rap amongst historians, which is something I really wanted to address in the book, because she does have a series of affairs. And I got to say, in this court, to have a series of affairs, that's like saying, I brushed my teeth in the morning. But she had a series of affairs, and the reason was that she was trapped in a love. She had the opportunity to get out of the marriage. She, after the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, but she remained in it to protect him, and it was a loveless marriage, because it turns out that when the bride's family goes out and murders every single person that is close to you on the groom's side, that is not a really good way to promote love and understanding between a husband and wife. This guy, you got to think about what these people were like. This kid was 18 years old in August. If he was alive today, he'd be going to freshman orientation at college. And he really was a kid. But before his mother died, she had to write him a letter that when he's going to come to court for the marriage, she had to say, please try to get the lice out of your hair before you come to court. This is what he was. He was a kid. And as far as he knew, she was in on it. Because who could believe that she wasn't part of it? If her whole family did it, why wouldn't she have known about it? But in fact, she was as much a victim as he was. But they never talked, and he wouldn't have believed her anyway. So he never trusted her, and he didn't want to have anything to do with her. And she was a person, she lost her father, who she loved when she was younger, and and her mother was not a loving, supportive mother. I think you could see that. In fact, on the bad mother scale of 0 to 10, I would call Catherine de Medici a 50. But she wanted to have love. And the reason that she had so many affairs was she was very dangerous to be around her. And so everyone she met, she never had more than one at a time, but they died. She'd fall in love with somebody and he died violently, and then she'd fall in the next one and he died violently. And I have to say one thing, she always believed that she had as much right to happiness and fulfillment as any man. And I gotta say, I kind of love that about her. So I've been chattering here. I tell you what, I hate to leave an unsubstantiated statement out there. So we're going to go back to the sex now and try and figure out why this court was so different from the other courts. And to do that, we have to go to the early life of Catherine de Medici. So this is a picture of Catherine de Medici when she's first married, or she's probably about 20 years. And that's her husband, Henri II, King of France. Now, Catherine de Medici, so she was born, she's part of the Medici family. They were a very, very wealthy family. They came from the merchant class. They weren't royal, who ruled Florence and occasionally bought the papacy and had a vote in there. And I kind of think of them as hedge fund money with a controlling interest in government. And Catherine, I had an interview with a young woman, and she said, my boyfriend said she was a Medici, and so she couldn't have had a bad early life, because they were rich. And it's true. If you go to Florence, you can see all the castles that she grew up in, because her parents, she was orphaned very early. Right after she was born, she was orphaned. Both parents died. And she went to live with relatives in Florence. And until she was 8 years old, she did live in those beautiful palaces that you see in Florence. But then, when she was 8, the Medicis fell from power in Florence, and it's a little different than how we change power here today. You know, we go to the voting booth and we pick a ruler, we vote for him, and there's a concession speech and a victory speech. In Florence in the 16th century, the way they changed government was the opposition and all the others got in a big room and came up with a plot to murder the people who were in power. And usually, even if they didn't get you actually murder you, it was a good time to leave. So all the Medicis left, but they just stuck Catherine, she was only 8, into a convent, thinking that that would save her, that no one would bother her. And that actually, that kind of made her an easy target. And so I would say her first introduction to sex was when they publicly debated what they should do with her. This is the opposition, the Medicis on left. Whether they should take her out of the convent and put her in a brothel, or whether they should take her out of the convent and give her to the army to be raped, or better yet, whether they should just strip her naked and chain her outside the walls of Florence. And she knew this. Now, they didn't do any of those things, but she knew that this was possible, and she actually had to cut off all her hair and assume a nun's habit in order to save herself. And the only people standing between her and this kind of behavior were the nuns. So she was forced to rely on them, and she learned at a very early age how to be accommodating. She was very obedient, she was obsequious, she was anything to cultivate so that the nuns would help her, and this is what she did when she came in, whenever she was in trouble, whenever she felt at risk. And then when she was 11 years old, the Medicis came back into power and everything changed. And so she got out of Florence, but she went to Rome, and she had a new cousin who was the Pope, and he arranged for her to marry the second son of the King of France, Henri, who, of course, his older brother's going to die, and he's going to become the King of France. So her next introduction to sex was when she came over to be married at the age of 14, and her husband was also 14, and because this was she came with a huge dowry there, it was considered a very advantageous marriage for Catherine because she wasn't of royal blood, but it kind of low for the King of France's son because she was marrying not somebody of high birth, but she came with such a big dowry, including parts of Italy, that the King of France wanted to do this. And because he wanted to make sure that this marriage went through and was consummated, her introduction to sex was that she lost her virginity on her wedding night in front of her father-in-law, which I cannot believe added to the experience, in my opinion. And then she has the problem that her husband wants nothing to do with her. He wants absolutely nothing to do with her because he is in love with somebody else. He's in love with a woman who's 19 years older than he is, with a really beautiful, the bombshell of the court, Diane de Poitiers. This is Diane de Poitiers. This is Catherine de Medici. This is Diane de Poitiers. Not a fair fight, really. Okay. So, well, let's leave Diane up there. And in fact, and then on top of all that, Catherine couldn't get pregnant. It took her a very long time to get pregnant. And there were a lot of people wanted to see the marriage annulled, especially like the Guise family, that dashing Duke of Guise. His family wanted the marriage annulled so that they could marry, so that Henri could marry, go back to the king, so that Henri could marry somebody else, could marry maybe a member of the Guise family. But Diane de Poitiers stood up for Catherine because here she's got this, and Catherine wasn't very attractive, here she's got this mousy little wife who isn't making any trouble at all. What does she need a new one for? It might be more attractive, more aggressive. So she supports Catherine, and she actually tries to help her get pregnant. Catherine's room was above Diane's in the palace, in the castle. And so what Diane would do was she would warm Henry up in her bed, send him up to Catherine real quick to do his duty, then he'd come back down to Diane's bed, stay with her all night, see her all day, and then this would go on. And this went on for somewhere between 5 to 7 years, until Catherine finally gave birth when she was 24 to her first child. And then after that, she ended up having 7 children who survived, 4 boys and 3 girls. But it wasn't just that. Diane did everything. Diane was queen in everything but name. She took care of, she was the one who was responsible for educating Henry. Henry wanted her to do the children, to take care of the children, to pick their tutors, to pick their clothes, she did their play dates. She was more their mother than Catherine was. And Catherine was forced to be nice to her on top of everything else. Catherine had to swallow it all down if she wanted to stay Henry's wife, even on the side, swallow it all down, and see Diane every day, be nice to her, spy for her. And this is again where this idea of sex as a weapon, sex as a threat comes into play. And so when Henri dies at 40 because he has a middle-age crisis and decides he's going to joust 3 times in one battle, all that was one. It's like taking the last ski run, right? You're going to fall. He got a glance in the eye and it got infected and he died. And then Catherine ends up taking over the court, and she puts into practice her ideas about sex, and that is how the court came to be the way it was. So now I think I have rattled on long enough. I think I've given you a good flavor for the Game of Thronesy aspects of this period. But if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Yes.
What happened to Diane now that she's a poet?
What happened to Diane when Catherine?
Now that she's a poet.
Catherine got rid of her, but you know it was very easy. It was very interesting because she didn't have to get rid of her. What happened was that Diane, you can see Diane is much more assertive, and Diane had become very rich and powerful as a result of being Henri's mistress. And she got a little too powerful for the Guise family, and they had a choice. They could back the grasping, imperious mistress, or they could support the little nothing of a wife who never. She was kind of the Uriah Heep of the 16th century. I mean, she just really would butter with nothing around. So that's Catherine, and that was a big mistake. Actually, then eventually she got her sea legs under her, and she became quite powerful. Oops, yes.
It was without a doubt the best historical novel I have ever read. I couldn't put it down. I finished it in 3 days. It was mesmerizing.
Are you talking about me or Elton?
Your book.
Oh, wow, thank you. Thank you.
I will tell you. But very exhausting. I've never. How did they have the energy to pursue these wars and the sex all together? No wonder they died. I have one question.
Yeah.
I know Marie de Medici came later, but where does she fit into Catherine?
That's very interesting because she ends up being, wait, this is too good. Yeah, here. She ends up being his legitimate wife. Marguerite married Henri, but she never had any children with him. And eventually they had to split. And they got an annulment because he needed a wife that could give children. So he had to marry Marie de Medici because he was in hack so much to her father. This is Henry IV. This is Henry, King of Navarre, is going to marry Marie de Medici. She's going to be the queen, and then she's going to have Louis XIII be is going to be her son.
And
right?
Marie marries him.
Yes, he grows up and becomes like the Abraham Lincoln. He becomes Henry IV. Paris is working mass. And she has to marry another Medici because they had all the money and he was financing his war. So he was in Hoxton for so much money he had to take his daughter. That's how. And he treated her just the way Henri II treated Catherine de Medici. He had mistresses in the house, never paid any attention to her. Same exact deal. It was like came around all over again. Anyone else? Yeah.
It's almost unrelated in some ways, but it's bothering me. When Catherine de Medici was in the Chateau de Chenonceau, one of the rooms was painted all in black. Was that from the death of her husband or from her son?
That would be the death of her husband.
Right.
and she didn't have that castle.
No, I know. it was-
Diane had it, and then after Diane left, they switched.
And she took it over almost as revenge.
Right.
But she wasn't really so much in mourning for her husband. Couldn't.
She separated love from sex. So, and all of her legitimacy came from being the wife, the legitimate wife. So to her, Henri was blameless. Her husband was blameless. It was all Diane. Diane was the evil person. Henri was the good person. You know, she loved. She always said she loved Henri. And that was. Then she went into deep mourning, and she was shocked when he died. But I will say, I have never seen someone's policies overturned so quickly as she overturned her husband's policies. So for, you know, it's like it's as though, you know, somebody you know said I love President Obama, but as soon as he dies, I'm getting rid of this random. Even though it's his signature legislation, we're getting rid of the health care. No, we're not going to, because usually when you love someone, you're kind of following their policies. But she associated everything bad with Diane. Sex was Diane. That's why she used sex as a weapon. Yes?
You obviously, in the book, unearth a lot about this mother-daughter relationship that you alluded to between Catherine and Margot. Can you just let us know, for those of us who haven't read the book yet, when you said this is a mother-daughter relationship, I got to look into it. Did they write to each other? Did other people write about their dealings with each other?
This is the first book that looks at just the two of them in their relationship to each other. But they have letters that they stayed at court. But Marguerite was a prisoner often of her. In order to protect this guy, you know, if he did something bad, she was punished, and she was punished, and she had to go into house arrest, and her life was threatened, and it was her mother was behind a lot of this, and she. Well, I don't want to say. It's just they were two very different. I wouldn't call Catherine brave, and I in fact, I know it sounds strange, but. When people say about the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, oh, this is just how things happened back then. And no, that's not how things happened. I have 3 books. Believe me, the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, that's in a class by itself. And today we call that a crime against humanity. And they would have called it a crime against humanity. And when you are the victim of it, everybody touched by that moment, by that massacre, changed in one way or another, and was affected by it. And in Marguerite, she grew up, and she became an opponent to her mother in many ways. She opposed it her politically. She said, this stuff is wrong. We want a more moderate. She allied with the Politique movement, which was the opposition, the Huguenots, and she tried to take the fight out, the whole religious fight out of France and make it a war against Spain and the Netherlands. That's what they were trying to do. And by the way, those are the policies that Louis XIV would use to such effectiveness in the next century. So they were good policies, but Catherine was very afraid of Spain, and she wouldn't do anything like that.
Did Marguerite remain a Catholic?
Always a Catholic, and she was, because he had to convert. He had to convert, and in order to stay alive, he had to convert. So she never had to worry about converting anymore.
And did they have surviving children?
They had no children. She couldn't have children, and that's why she had to be annulled. And that's why he married Marie de Medici. Yes?
Brings me down to did Catherine de Medici have something to do with the fork?
What?
With the fork, the implement of the fork?
You know, I thought the fork was English. She brought a lot of Italian culture. She brought the ballet. She didn't really bring it. She brought a lot of, her son had Henri III, was when ballet really came on. He was homosexual. So they had a lot of, that was the whole Apollo, the beautiful bodies, and that kind of dancing. So I think you could say ballet was born during her time.
I meant the fork to eat.
I know, I don't know if she did the fork. I thought that was English, actually.
Actually, the fork was Norman.
Yeah.
Was it?
Was it?
Norman.
So I don't know. I didn't. You know, with all this killing grilling and all this sex, I didn't know that they
Well,
did.
But
I'm not, I'll look it up.
a flying team would tell you that the French and the Parisians ate as the Germans ate until Catherine de' Medici arrived, and she brought the food of Florence to France, and that was their first taste of real food.
That's
That's
baloney.
true. That is the known.
Well, I don't know if that's, I'm sure, she brought a lot, she would not have brought anything, until she became queen, because she did, look, Francois Premier invaded Italy, and he brought back Leonardo da Vinci with him. And so there was already a lot going back and forth, about Italian culture. And Catherine certainly maintained her relationship with Florence, and there were Florentines coming back and forth. But I wouldn't necessarily think that all Italian cooking came from them.
Marie had the chefs brought over.
She's
Marie
later.
Medici, but it was her Catherine
See,
that
everyone
brought
knows
the
food.
influence.
Oh, yes.
So I too am just loving the book.
Thank
It's
you.
fantastic. And I'm curious, was there anything in your research that talked about what was the shift for Catherine in her personality or courage that brought her from someone who was very accommodating to someone more...
You know what happened? There was a moment where, actually, the poor guy who she's going to assassinate is going to be assassinated in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, where the head of the Huguenots was named Admiral Coligny. And Admiral Coligny suggested to Catherine that she should be running the government, and that he would help her. And she hated the Guises because they were trying to get rid of her when she was newly married. So she said, well, this is a good, Catherine had no clue what France was really like. She had been shunted off to the side for a long time. All she saw was the court. She had no idea that the Huguenots did not have sufficient numbers to protect her. Believe me, the one thing, if she could have gone back and done it over again, she would not have sided with the Huguenots. She just didn't understand what was happening. So this guy said, why don't you take over the government? I'll help you. She said, great idea, I'll do that. And that's what happened. And then the Catholic side said, are you kidding? We have all the numbers. And they got an army together, and she said to her Huguenot friends, come save me. And they said, are you kidding? We can't save you. We don't have those kind of numbers. And that's when she knew she was on it, right there. But then she was stuck. She was kind of stuck by that time. Yes?
I just was wondering, I haven't read your book, but I was wondering if you used the memoirs Margaret de Valois.
Yes, that's who that's this woman. That's her memoir. She was a great, it's really hard to write a good memoir, without being self-serving, and her voice she was terrific. Yeah, I did use them.
And how can one get a copy of her memoirs?
How can you get a copy of her memoirs?
Yeah, or anybody carries it, or?
Yeah, you can get it. I think you can probably get it as a used book, or if you go online, you could find a copy of them.
Or any library?
Not any library, academic library would have it. That you could ask. They're available. They're in public domain. Yes.
Leaving aside war and food, can you tell us anything about some interesting fashion innovations that came out of this time?
Marguerite she was the top fashion person in Paris when she was. Yes, let's go back to those and see. And yes, there we go. They had all that material. Actually, what's really interesting was they had these big corset things around in the middle, and they were made of bone or something really heavy, and she was actually, it's kind of operated like a bulletproof vest, because somebody shot at her and it got caught in her corset. So she always wore them then for the rest of her life, even when they went out of fashion. Let's see, what did they have? They were mostly, this is what they looked like. They had the big collars. It was the Elizabethan time. They had lots of jewelry. I have descriptions of the clothes in lots of yellow satin and ermine. And when she got married in a blue gown that had a train, 15 feet long that 3 people had to carry or something like that. And it was August, and she must have been dying and sweating in it. But you can look it up.
Were there any signifiers that people wore to show that they were people of faith or religion, or was that out the window?
Yeah, well, the Protestants wore dark colors. That's how you knew that, especially Calvinists. Interesting, Catherine de' Medici was the first one to wear high heels as a woman. Men had worn them, but that's because when she was 14 and got married, they wanted her to look taller, so they put her in heels. That was the first time. This is the time they're off the cone hats. That was before. You can see if you wore ermine, if you were royal, or the little fleur-de-lis to show that you were a member of the royal family. That was pretty much it.
And what about smells, odors?
They did bathe. Marguerite soaked in tubs with rose petals. Henry did bathe. Let's get Henry back here. Henry smelled of garlic. He slept on the floor. He didn't like to bathe when he bathed. But he really liked to make love after he'd gone hunting. Didn't take his boots off. So he could smell. In fact, people noticed that he smelled, which is probably why the lice. But women did bathe, especially in maybe not the peasantry, but in Marguerite's court there are actual descriptions of her soaking herself in a tub with rose petals to be beautiful. And of course they had perfumes, they had lots of perfumes, they had makeup which made them break out, which is too bad. They loved blonde hair, they all wore wigs to be blonde. She was dark haired, but she wore a blonde wig when she wanted to. That was it. Yeah?
After the massacre,
Yes.
where did the Huguenots go?
Well, a lot of them died. 1 or 2 of them escaped and got to England. Because it was 800, you invite your guests to the wedding, you're going to have your closest friends, the top people. They really did, they were killed. 1 or 2 got away, and he was saved by Marguerite, and his cousin, the Prince of Condé, also was saved. They both had to convert. And they were so young. That's another reason Catherine was able to stay in power for so long. It took these guys a long time to grow up and confront her. You have something like that happen to you when you're 18, and then they kept by court and kind of under house arrest. She didn't have anyone to threaten her anymore. It took until they were in their 30s, really, and then they were good promises.
Following up on the Huguenots who survived, I heard that Frederick the Great invited many of the survivors to settle in Russia. Are you familiar with that?
I think that's later, Frederick the Great, isn't he?
Right, but so some Huguenots survived.
Oh yes, well then they converted too. They had tradesmen. The people who didn't go to the wedding in Navarre, they survived, and the people who were in La Rochelle, they survived. And then there was more conversions, and the tradespeople all. It was the guild people who were Huguenots, and they survived. And you did have people, and then there were people who converted after that because they felt this was wrong. And so you did have people, but the top advisors around the kingdom, that was fun. Oh, I think we're done. 6:30. Thank you so much for coming. I appreciate it.